Welcome everyone from a very snowy Zurich. To celebrate the beginning of the Advent season, we just had one of the largest snowfalls ever recorded for December. My name is Filippo Lancieri and I'm a postdoc here at the ETH Zurich Center for Law and Economics. And I'm very happy to introduce Professor Paul Ohm from the Georgetown University Law Center. Paul is actually a leading scholar in law and technology, and he does so because he's actually one of the very first people to combine law and computer sciences, knowing both disciplines very well. And we're going to talk about his new paper called, let me get it right, Focusing on Fine-Tuning, New Pathways for Fixing What is Wrong with Generative AI, which is forthcoming in the Columbia Science and Technology Law Review. Welcome, Paul. So let's start with the basics. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what are foundational AI models, what is fine-tuning, and what is in-context learning, which are three key concepts of your new article.
So thank you, Filippo. It's wonderful to be here with you. So this is writing about the moving target that is generative AI. So I'm focused primarily on large language models, but also on the diffusion image models. And so what I'm describing, I mean, one of the strange things about being alive today is 18 months ago, this would have been a very different conversation.
No one knew what AI was.
Right.
Oh, AI is this thing that's just happening out there.
Yeah, and 18 months from now, who knows? But right now we're in this particular moment where I've been astonished to see the way the kind of technological field has decided that when you're going to do something like train a large language model, you actually do it in two separate phases. And so this implements an old AI concept called transfer learning. And the idea here is you want to build a general purpose model. This is not to be confused with artificial general intelligence, we can talk about later. But the idea is you train a general model. The general model is extremely powerful, but kind of like not specialized at anything. And then the essence of transfer learning is you do a second phase that they call fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is where it learns how to do kind of useful skills applying this general knowledge it has. And so these two phases, we call the first one pre-training, we call the second one fine-tuning. That's the focus of my new paper.
And everybody knows ChatGPT right now, right? So if putting ChatGPT context, so what will be the difference between so the fine-tuned model is like ChatGPT itself?
Right. Yeah, and I'm all about precision, right? So with ChatGPT, we're actually talking about a model called GPT-4. And so one key thing is ChatGPT is kind of the friendly user interface on top of the model. But GPT-4 itself is actually an entire family of models. And so there's one model called GPT-4 Core. It's this base model, it's this foundation model. And again, it's seen millions and millions, perhaps billions of sentences of language. And so in some deep way, it is able to construct sentences. But it's amazing what it doesn't know how to do. For example, it's not really good at answering a question. And so question answering is something that comes in through fine-tuning. And question answering, by the way, is a step removed from back and forth conversation, which is, of course, the hallmark of ChatGPT. So you have GPT-4 Core. I don't know the names of all the other fine-tuned models. You have a separate one which might be good at answering a single question. And then you have a third one that understands the notion of a back and forth conversation. And so the key to understanding this is these are three different models trained in three different ways, but they're all connected to this foundation model.
Great. So the main proposal of your article is that if you're going to talk about AI regulation, we should be talking more about regulating the fine-tuning process rather than the development of the foundational model. So why is this a better solution? Can you explain to people who are not into this world, like why exactly this should be, why we should be doing?
Yeah, and it gives me an opportunity to think and talk a little bit more about my general approach to the law and computer science interchange that I've been trying to advance. A colleague once described me as an import-export specialist, and I think he meant it as a compliment. Other people thought I'd be insulted. And my favorite type of law review article to write, I've only managed to pull this off successfully a couple of times, is everything you seem to know about this computer science technology is wrong. I love nothing more when there is this disconnect between what the computer scientists understand and where the legal scholars tend to be. And I, of course, don't mean every legal scholar. But for example, one thing that legal scholars all know at this point is that training a large language model is time-consuming, expensive, In my paper, I have a claim that I can't justify, but it may be among the single most expensive industrial activities we perform today, right? And not something we'd want to do more than once if we can avoid it. And what I'm trying to highlight in my paper is all of that is true for the foundation model. And so yes, we don't want to force a company, if we can avoid it, to retrain a foundation model. That's a kind of...
And basically this training is like you just get all the data that's available and then you put it through the algorithm and you make like, okay, let's see what comes out of it, and it's just very raw.
And it literally takes, you know, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and months and months and months to do this, right? And so when people talk about the dawn of GPT-5, whenever that comes about, someone in OpenAI is spending lots of time preparing for training the pre-training model, and then they're going to spend even more time actually, training the pre-training model. And so the point I want to make is none of that is true for fine-tuning. So when I say that everything legal scholars know is wrong, they only understand, some of them only understand what happens in pre-training. They're missing the great possibilities of fine-tuning.
Yeah. So let's try to get this a little bit more concrete for the people listening to us. So imagine that we would ensure, for example, that an AI model is not biased against, I don't know, African Americans or something like this. So what would it mean to try to prevent this bias at the foundational model side versus the fine-tuning part of the process?
Yeah, and again, it's such an unusual time to be writing in legal scholarship because over the last 10 years, there's been amazing writing. I haven't actually been doing much of this writing about bias in machine learning models. And again, they have this conceit that you want to, so one thing you often hear is garbage in, garbage out. So the reason we have biased models is because we've trained these models on biased data, and that's absolutely true. But there is an emerging kind of understanding among computer scientists, and this is far from universal and it's far from proven, that you actually maybe don't want to take the bias out during pre-training.
So basically you want to keep all the data in.
You want to keep all the data in, and some of it is going to be terribly biased, and some of it's going to be worse. It's going to be racist, and it's going to have all of these things. And to be clear, we still don't understand exactly kind of what super biased data does to the pre-training model. But there is an understanding that if what we want to do is generate a model that doesn't say biased things, doing it in pre-training may be the worst of both worlds. It may be that you don't know how to really identify and get rid of the biased data. It may be that once you've deleted the data, you're actually not going to generate a model that creates unbiased statements. But then worst of all, it may be that it will be worse at language skills generally. Now, contrast this with fine-tuning. Up until now, I've focused a lot on what pre-training costs and entail. I think if there's one takeaway from this paper that I'd love the kind of typical legal scholar to take away, computer scientists still continue to impress and amaze themselves by how much you can do in fine-tuning with very little. And so, remember I talked about months of training for pre-training. Fine-tuning can happen really quickly. It can be very inexpensive. And we think a lot about how much data is required to train a model. You need millions or billions of sentences during pre-training. To make a model less biased, it may be that you can show it 50 or 100 or maybe even 1,000 examples. That costs nothing. It's not that hard to generate 1,000 examples. And so it's not just that getting rid of bias during pre-training may not work as well and may take a long time. It may actually be more effective from a efficiency point of view, but even from an accuracy point of view, to wait until fine-tuning.
Okay. And would this work, for example, also in privacy? Because in a way, once privacy is about like getting the data and processing the data, like the personal data, so you would just recommend the same thing for data privacy, for example.
100%, 100%.
Need all the data that you can, and ultimately you make sure that whatever it's spitting out.
Yeah, and if I may, we need to be really accurate. I find that, especially if they're machine learning experts watching, I find that when they talk about privacy, they talk about one very narrow and specific harm, which they call the harm of memorization. And so you've all seen documented examples where you can get ChatGPT, if it's not properly fine-tuned, to spit out a social security number or a phone number or something like that. And so that's one definition of privacy. I'll come back later with a longer paper and we can talk about more subtle and nuanced definitions of privacy. But with that out of the way, yes, I think that fine-tuning a model to spit out fewer social security numbers is a lot less expensive and again, a lot more attainable in the fine-tuning phase. Now, I want to say this caveat repeatedly throughout this video. we're not sure, right? And so, real computer scientists who are here, I play one on TV sometimes, they may say, well, we don't know for sure. Maybe there's some sorts of privacy harms. Maybe there's some sorts of bias harms, which we're better off dealing with the pre-training phase. And so this is not a universal rule that I'm announcing, but I think strategically, if what we're really trying to do is do things efficiently and accurately, we're better off waiting until fine-tuning.
And how would you, so who should be the party leading this discussion, right? Should this come through like industry self-regulation, or you believe the government has to intervene? Is the moment to intervene? So how do you think about this trade-off between the heavy hand of the government versus letting the industry experiment, but at the same time?
Yeah, and again, fine-tuning opens the door to all sorts of different governance models. And so one thing I really love about fine-tuning is in different jurisdictions, here we are sitting in Europe, I do most of my work in the United States. Famously, we have kind of different regulatory and governance approaches for everything. Another advantage of fine-tuning is you literally could have different versions of the model for every jurisdiction. Now, there are technologists who just felt a chill run down their spine, right? This feels like too much government, too much governance, too heavy-handed. And so one thing about this paper is you can actually take the basic insight and apply your own version of how much regulation is too much regulation. Since you asked me for my opinion, right, I don't trust technologists to deal with some of these nuanced societal questions by themselves. I've been sort of frustrated over a career watching most solutions running through the technologists and then the technologists not being super nuanced about how to implement the recommendations. So I would love to have a kind of participatory process. It doesn't have to be a legislature in a global capital passing legislation, but I would love something more than just self-regulation by the technologists.
Okay. And I think that's a great moment to end, I think, because I think we covered so much. So if you're a policymaker, now some people listening to us are going to be policymakers or technologists, so what kind of research would you want to see that may help us design better policy, right? So what do you think is the missing link that you say, like, oh, if we want to make this translation, where would you focus your effort on?
Right, I mean, again, these are early days for a lot of this research, and so a lot of this we're not certain about yet. And so one thing that is really happening is there's a lot of research on fine-tuning and what can be accomplished and what cannot be accomplished. And I fully expect in the next few years, 2 or 3 fundamental new understandings about this. So at the very least, we need to kind of defer to that and allow that process to play out. But in addition, I think that we need to, as people on the policy side of the divide instead of on the technology side, kind of think about the capabilities of fine-tuning. So one concrete example is I think a lot about judicial injunctions at this point, and how we tend to think of kind of AI problems as the province of legislatures and statutes, right? But especially in the U.S. system where we have a
major copyright lawsuits,
judiciary, right? So copyright's a great example where, and again, I think some on the more libertarian bent are going to hate this statement. You might have one judge in one courtroom in New York City looking at one plaintiff's set of copyrighted pictures, and until they had this understanding of fine-tuning, they might not think they had the power to say, please recreate your model, but stop infringing this particular set of pictures, right? Or this particular set of texts.
And this in practice would mean basically delete the current model and retrain it all.
Right, that was the conventional understanding until now, but it's not at all true. Instead, what you're going to say is, I'm commanding you to fine-tune, right? And in the US, we're gonna have a big fight about the First Amendment and whether judges can properly do that. My take is, yes, they can. But they now have this capability without being laughed out of the courtroom to say, come back in a week and have a new version of your model that is running for the world to use, that's no longer committing the infringing act or the defaming act or the harassing act or whatever we're litigating over. And so that's going to empower the entire judiciary to solve problems. And the other nice thing about this that we haven't talked about is you can fine-tune a model that's been previously fine-tuned, which means we don't have to solve the world's problems all at once. You can have each judge in each jurisdiction, hopefully showing restraint and an understanding of the bigger picture, solving each problem one by one as they're presented.
That's interesting. But I guess if you had to recommend, you would say this is probably not the best area for judges to. Would you recommend restraint for final question? If you're a judge sitting on a lawsuit for a copyright violation for books or something like this, what would your decision be, even if you assume there is a copyright violation?
Again, and I'm gonna follow the tenor of the question. I might surprise you with the answer, but I am really committed to thinking about the way we increase, governance participation across the spectrum, right? And ideally, this is in large bore, large forum manners like legislation, right? We can all get together and deliberate over legislation. But I think there's space for individual, judges with expert litigants, kind of dealing with individual harms one by one. Perhaps it's not the big picture solution. It might be that we want, omnibus legislation that deals with the big problems, but then allowing the judges to do their piece one by one. It's sort of in the kind of spirit of the common law tradition, right? This might be the way to end up with something that is, in the main, just and fair and all of the other goals we have for it, but also
fine-tuned
to
the specific,
right, to the specific context of our individual situations.
And so if the focus also on fine-tuning, this brings another interesting discussion, which is the open source models, right? So I guess if you have an open source model where you just release the model out there, you kind of lose the ability to fine-tune. So do you understand that?
It is true, and it's one of the kind of places this paper has dragged me into that I didn't anticipate, right? I understand the kind of pro-competitive and pro-innovation arguments for releasing a model. So when we say open source, we mean literally releasing the model weights into the world. But what my research has led me to understand is if you pre-train and then fine-tune a model and then you release it, you cannot fine-tune that model anymore, right? You can create a new version of it that's fine-tuned, but that prior model that's in the world is now out in the world. And going back to earlier in our conversation, if it's biased, if it's racist, if it's defamatory, if it invades privacy, you have no recourse whatsoever. It's just out there, it lives in the world. And so, although this is, taken me to a place I wouldn't have been earlier in my career, there's actually virtue to having gatekeepers and companies that limit access to their models. And again, I'm not making a competition argument. I'm thinking of other harms outside competition. But if you really believe that fine-tuning in my army of judges is the answer to bring about a reduction in harm, it's an argument against open source, at least in the most aggressive open ways.
Would you say that the foundational model is almost like a natural monopoly? Is this how you see it?
Again, you're more of the antitrust scholar than I am, but that analogy did kind of come to me that in a funny way. And again, in this era, it's so funny for me to be making an argument about letting the big tech companies be the big tech companies. But sure, there is an argument that these have natural monopoly-like characteristics, and that in a sense, especially because they require so much capital investment to spring into being, as a society, it's not the kind of thing we want to have 50 competitors doing, right? Putting aside the other natural monopoly characteristics. And so from a kind of policy point of view, maybe we enter a world where there are a few foundation models, hopefully some publicly generated ones, hopefully some nonprofit generated ones. But then after that, you fine-tune to create different versions where the competition comes in and the copyright issues. And this probably means, given the way these things are paid for, lots of money going to a very small number of very large parties. And again, we have to have policies to make sure that that doesn't lead to different types of harms and abuses.
Thank you. So thank you again, Paul, for such an interesting chat. It was really a pleasure. It is a pleasure to host you here at ETH, and an even bigger pleasure to record this chat with you.
No, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation, and I've been having such a great time here. Thank you for being wonderful hosts.
And to our vlog viewers back home, thank you very much for sticking with us and to listening and watching this chat. We look forward to seeing you again next time.